Hi, I'm Nathalie Edmond from Mindful and Multicultural Counseling in New Jersey, coming at you again to talk about how to become anti-racist. I use that language because I think it is an active process of recommitment on a daily basis about whether or not I'm willing to be anti-racist. So I figured today that I would talk a little bit about what is white supremacy and how does that relate to privilege, particularly white privilege. So I'm going to read a definition to you of white supremacy from Frances Lee Ansley, which says, "By white supremacy, I do not mean to allude only to the self-conscious racism of white supremacist hate groups. I refer instead to a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings." That is a mouthful. So, what I translate that as is it's a system instead of a person or a group. And so that's one myth I want to challenge, right? That it is everywhere because it's a system. So when people talk about institutional racism, they're talking about the white supremacist culture that we live in. So why is it important to know this? Because we have to be able to, one, say the name, the phrase white supremacy, right? Because that is the culture that we live in. And every day we are making choices about whether we dismantle white supremacy, meaning the system, or we're complicit with it, meaning we go about our daily life allowing the system to keep operate, because this country was founded on white supremacy, right? I mean, that's our history, not the history I was taught in school, right? But if we really look at our history, right, that this land that we call the United States was inhabited by the indigenous people of this country. And Europeans came to this country hundreds of years ago seeking riches and opportunity, or just ways to care for their family in a different way, or to start a new life. And they came here, right? If we look at the early writings, even like that lead to the Declaration of Independence, that part of the reasons why people wanted to separate from England was that England was moving away from slavery. And there were people who did not want that to happen because they saw the opportunity to enslave people would help them gain resources, gain riches, right? So that is the foundation of this country. That is our history. And one step is to own that, right? And that we, the United States, continued with slavery for a long time. And that has a legacy that is here, even if those enslaved people are physically gone. It lives through the generations. And that the system, right, which is, our government, our law enforcement, our schools, our social services, our healthcare system, all of those are systems that are influenced by white supremacy, right? And if we look through history, we see that over and over and over again, we persecute people, that we have hatred for people who are different from us, who look different from us, who talk different from us, who have different cultures and beliefs. And that all those people who came to the United States, many of them who looked what we now call white, were known as something different. And at some point, if you look through cases over time, they achieved the status of whiteness. Some, particularly, most people of color groups, which is basically anything non-white, did never achieve that status, right? So many people don't connect to privilege, right? But privilege is power, resources that come from benefiting from the white supremacy culture. So that means, right, that with privilege, you have access to things that people without the privilege do not have. Privilege is the ability to not have to think about certain things, right? That is privilege. So you might not have a lot of money, but whiteness gets you through some doors. Some doors appear invisible, but to other people, it's very clear that they're not allowed access. And even if they are allowed access, it's usually at quite a cost, or they have to appear perfect in order to not step into any of the stereotypes that you might have about the group they come from. So I'm very aware when I walk into predominantly white spaces of my race. And I often walk into predominantly white spaces, whether it was when I was going to school, whether it's places that I've worked, whether it's certain towns I go through. But let me ask you, right? If you're a white person, how often do you walk into spaces where you are not, where you are the minority? How often does that happen? And when it does happen, when you are the minority, meaning the majority of the room is, let's say, people of color and you're a white person, how often do you feel uncomfortable? Maybe a little scared or self-conscious, right? That is a daily experience for some people. So privilege is to be able to look around the room and see and not even pay attention because everybody looks like you, at least skin tone wise, right? And the sad thing is that this race stuff is a social construction, right? That there's research that says that there are more in-group differences than between group differences. But once upon a time, some group of people thought it was worthwhile to differentiate people based on their physical features. And that has persisted, right? So more about privilege, right? That privilege allows people to experience COVID-19 in a different way, right? Why are more Black and brown bodies dying because of COVID? It's because of the history of racism. It's not that we have this genetic, biological marker that makes us more vulnerable. It's the history of oppression that exists in this United States, the history of segregation, the history of being not allowed to live in certain places, to not allowed to have the same amount of education, to be not allowed to buy houses in particular areas, has created these opportunities for quite differences, right? And that's where race and class intersect with each other, right? That perhaps in communities of color, there are more people who do essential jobs, meaning that they can't work from home, that they have to go to their place of employment to continue to be paid. And so that makes them more vulnerable to acquiring COVID, right? Perhaps they live in places that are more urban areas. Perhaps they live more in apartments, right? And so all those things make them much more vulnerable to dying from COVID. That is a history of white supremacy at play. So you'll see this picture here, which is the white supremacy pyramid, which I think is really powerful to look at because it shows that there's overt kind of white supremacy, which is kind of the things that are usually socially unacceptable. That seems to be less true in the last couple of years based on just change in leadership. But for many decades, right, we have things like KKK, lynching, burning of things, crosses, police brutality. Those are like blatant white supremacy, overt kind of racism things. But then we see that there are so many more things that are covert, meaning they're underground, they're coded, right? There are a lot of ways after the civil rights era that racism went underground. And so it made us believe for a long time that things were better. And they have been better in many ways. And yet there's still so many people suffering. So just some things, right, that I want you to think about is some of the covert ways that white supremacy persists. Colorblindness, right? When I was a kid, that was what people did. They were colorblind, right? It was that, a statement like, I don't care if you're red, white, blue, green, right? Which even that statement by itself is kind of insulting because people aren't actually those colors, right? But when you look at me, I want you to see that I'm a Black person. I don't want that to be all that you see, but I want you to see that. Because if you're a white person, our experiences are different simply by the color of our skin. And if you don't know that, if you don't get that, I don't know how many meaningful conversations we're going to have. So some other things that are covert white supremacy, right? Things like making racist jokes or saying things like, oh, that was just a joke, or I didn't mean that, or you're taking it too seriously, right? Because that invalidates the person's experience. Having token people of color friends, right? Or having only like one element of diversity in your company, right? Those are elements of white supremacy, right? And it could go on and on with this list. I invite you to take a look at this list and see what else is there, right? Saying things like, slavery was a long time ago. Why don't you get over it? Or like this idea of the American dream, or, just I pulled myself up by the bootstrap, right? I just worked hard enough, right? And that doesn't undermine that people are working hard, right? But that meritocracy, this idea that I earned everything, that is not the true, because there is privilege, which makes it easier for some people to access things than others. And if we look throughout history, we will see that there were always exceptions, right? That even at times of slavery, there were people who were free. There were people who had a little bit more money, right? That even now, right? Yeah, we have people of color who are wealthy, who are, we had a president who was biracial. We've had basketball players and movie stars and talk show hosts and reporters, so many amazing people who have worked hard, right? And thinking about all the challenges they must have had to go through to get that far. But that isn't the story for most people. So I invite you to think about what's challenging about white supremacy for you. And whether you're a white person or a person of color, it impacts us all. They say that people of color think about race every day, and that white people rarely think about race. I mean, right now, it's kind of popping up in a lot of places. Are we having more Black people murdered by police officers now? I doubt it. But we have technology that allows us to see it, which we didn't used to have. And there are all the people who are experiencing racism through law enforcement that never make the media. It's built into the system. It's not just that there are bad apples, it's that the whole orchard is bad. It's built on white supremacy. It's in our conditioning. Just look at what you see in the newspaper, on TV, right? I feel so privileged that my kids get to grow up seeing more people who look like themselves. That was rare when I was a kid. Things are getting better, and there are many things that need to change. It's not that the system is broken, it's that the system was created for white people. It was always meant to be that way. Why are Black and brown people so angry and so sad? Because this has been going on for hundreds of years in one shape or another. And very few people were willing to listen. Listen enough to have an uprising. Because that's how the system crumbles, is that people who are not directly impacted care. And how do we start to care? We expose ourselves. We meet people who look different than us. We find out their stories. We find out history. We figure out what part are we playing. It is not for people of color to tell you about the history. It is for you to find it out yourself. It is not for you as a white person to focus on your intent. It's the impact that whatever you're saying or doing or not doing. Because silence is powerful. Silence is power. The ability to not have to say anything, that's privilege. To not get it, to be able to be numb, that is privilege. To be able to call the police and feel like they will listen to you, that they will help you, that is privilege that comes from white supremacy. And part of the reason that white supremacy lives on and persists for generations is that people are asleep. They're just taking care of their day-to-day life. And the system was built for people to not really think about it. So how do you start to awaken? How do you start to sit in some of the discomfort and meet up with other people of your own affinity group to talk about this stuff? Because people of color need to take care of themselves. They need to grieve, they need to rage, they need to feel their feelings without having to take care of you. What's this phrase, white fragility? It's whenever these topics come up, white people are so uncomfortable with it, perhaps because you never really had to think about it. That's part of your privilege. But then, so often it puts brown and Black people in a place to either have to push back, which is at risk to them, or potentially activate your tears or your anger. And sometimes it's just not worth it. So I invite you to think about, how do you make space for people of color to have honest and meaningful conversations with you, so that you've done your own education, so they're not having to teach you. If you have people of color friends, are you reaching out to them? Seeing how they're doing? The trauma that they're experiencing from seeing all these Black bodies murdered? And to say murdered is validating. Let's call it what it is. But the thing about white supremacy, which makes it so powerful, when I think about the police brutality, is that police officers, I believe that they go into the job to do good for their communities. But they grow up in this conditioning, in this white supremacist culture, in which they're taught to fear Black bodies. And I can't imagine being a police officer, taking care of your local community, and being afraid. And in that moment, you make a choice. And I think for many people it is an unconscious choice, because that's how biases happen. They're unconscious and we're trying to make them conscious, right? And this idea of like fight, flight, freeze, I believe it as a psychologist. I absolutely believe it. But the only way free is to own it, to be curious about it, to do some of these meditations, to sit with one's distress, and to be accountable to yourself and to your whole community. Would love to hear some of your questions and your thoughts. Please reach out to me and let me know what you're thinking and how you're feeling, and perhaps I'll answer some of your questions in the coming series as we continue to dive deeper into these topics. I leave you with a greeting of Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om means we're all connected. Shanti means peace. I wish all of that for all of you. May we meet again.